Great. My name's Matt Kirby. My wife, Amy, and I, and our 5 children are deeply rooted here at the Heights. Amy and I have been going here for over 20 years, and we are all in the Next Gen Ministries. Yeah, so I was fortunate to grow up in a Christian household with a very obedient family. So I actually saw obedience and giving from a very young age. My father would talk about it. We would do it. The tithe was extremely important in our family. And so you fast forward to becoming an adult, and Amy and I get married, and we struggled. In fact, our first year was paying off school loans and sharing a car just to get to work and back. But we still found a way, even in that environment, to give and obediently give consistently and faithfully. And then fast forward a little more, now we're 30 or so, and I remember feeling very called to start giving to a local ministry, a specific local ministry, and Amy and I both did. Almost immediately, I went to okay, so what does that mean I need to take out of the part of my giving that I give to the church? And that was just logically, I give 10%. And I had a ton of conviction about that. And I needed to figure out where this conviction came from. And that's honestly the point of which my heart posture, Amy and I's heart posture towards giving changed. I started looking, biblically speaking, what did giving look like? And I found, okay, before the Mosaic law even came in, there was giving. In fact, God said, Moses, go and gather gifts for the tabernacle. And it actually said, and they will give according to essentially what is movement in their heart. It uses a word in 2 Corinthians that I loved, and this changed the way Amy and I started looking at giving. It says cheerful giver, but if you really look at it, the word is actually translated from Greek back to English as hilarious. The word hilarious. And so can that be a posture that we have in giving, that we're that joyful, that it's hilarious? And we entered into that. And so, that's the moment though, where I really feel like we found a new depth to the act of worship, of giving, where it was actually side by side with Jesus himself, the Holy Spirit guiding what we were going to do. That ministry specifically in 2012 that Amy and I felt pretty convicted to start giving to outside of what we were already giving. Months later, we found out that they actually lost their largest giver because that person had lost their job at the time almost 2 months after we began. And so clear picture, and actually faith grows faith. We always say that, right? But we were faithful in that moment. And it was so clear at that time because it was oh my goodness. God literally was prompting us that because he knew this is how he was going to fund this ministry to continue. And that's pretty neat. When it comes to legacy, honestly, Amy and I aren't too worried about what happens after we give money. Because what we do is we look for, did God actually ask us to give to this? And the minute the answer is yes, we give. We don't need anybody to call us all the time. We don't need emails all the time. We don't need to know anything. We know we were supposed to give to this. And then if we give right here with the right hand, and then 2 days later, we clearly have been asked to get involved in something else. We don't look at what this hand did. We just walk in this hand and say, yes, let's walk in this. Any legacy that's left, it's because of those that we're discipling, we're walking through life, whether it's our children or people around us, just see Jesus's work. And that's the legacy.
Isn't that good? I love me some Matt Kirby. I'm grateful for you, brother. Matt teaches in our 11th grade on Sunday morning. Where are the 11th graders at? There you go. Yeah, he teaches there in our student ministry. That's amazing. Hey, if we have not met yet, my name's David, one of the pastors here. If you have your Bible, and I hope that you do, go ahead and open it up to Matthew 25. Matthew 25 is where we're gonna be. Gary started us out last week in a new series that we're calling Leave a Legacy. And I'm just gonna pick up where Gary left off in Matthew 25. And I gotta tell you this as you're turning there, this week as I was studying and praying through this passage, something really struck me. You know how sometimes you read something a few times before, maybe you've heard it a dozen times, but then it just kind of hits you differently one time? This is a passage that's about gifts and talents that God gives to us. That's what this passage is about. But it hit me this week. This is a story that's not primarily about the gifts and talents that God gives to us and what we do with those gifts and talents. This is a story about the God who gives us those gifts and talents. This is a parable that's about perception. It's about how we see God. Let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed how two people can walk through the exact same situation and come out seeing it in completely different ways? Like tomorrow night, you'll be watching the Cowboys game. Let's just imagine that two people are watching the Cowboys game. They're watching the exact same play. Dak goes back to pass, Dak throws a pass. One fan says, "That's my quarterback." Another fan sinks back in his couch and said, "That's my quarterback." Same play, same Dak, completely different outcomes. But it's not just sports, right? Think about someone who's going through a hard season and they say, "God must be punishing me." Someone goes through the exact same thing and they say, "God must be preparing me." Same situation, same God, totally different conclusions. Now, in that scenario, what makes the difference? I'm sure some of it could be personality. Some people are just more optimistic than others. Could be circumstance. Some people may have more support than other people. But I think something deeper is going on in that scenario. I think there's something deeper than circumstance and personality, because I think the primary thing that's going on is that it's an issue of perception. It's about how you see God. This is very much about how you see God. And I'm just telling you, you may not even realize it, but every decision that you make, every relationship, every reaction, everything is being shaped by how you see God. Everything. And I just think if we're honest, a lot of us may go through life with this low-grade misunderstanding of who God really is. Like we may say, "Yes, God loves me." But deep down, you're not really sure that God actually likes you. Like we may talk about grace, but you're still trying to earn God's approval. We may raise our hands and worship him as Lord, and yet in the back of our minds still think that he's keeping score. And the reason that I can say that, the reason I'm confident in saying that, is because years ago, that was me. I grew up in church and knew all the right answers. But deep down, there was something in me that thought, yeah, God's probably disappointed in me. Until one night, a friend of mine gave me a book by a guy named A.W. Tozer called Knowledge of the Holy. And about midnight, I opened up that book and I read the first page of that book. I read the first sentence of that book. And there was a line in there that completely rocked me to my core. And I am not kidding you that I mean that it changed the trajectory of my life forever. Here it is, page 1, you'll see it on the screen. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. For this reason, the most important fact about any person is not what he at a given time may say or do, but what he in his deep heart conceives God to be like. We tend by a secret law of the soul to move toward our mental image of God. Book drops out of my hand and it clicks. Because I realized the reason that I lived like God was disappointed in me was because that's how I saw him. My life was being shaped not by who God really is, but by this imagination that I had about God in my head. Wrecked me, man. hit me like a freight train. And from that moment, this truth has shaped me ever since. You become who you believe God is. One point to this sermon, one point only. You become who you believe God is. Let me show you how that works. If you believe that God is disappointed in you, as sure as I'm standing here, you'll live afraid. If you believe that God is demanding of you, you'll live exhausted. But on the flip side, if you see God as generous, you'll live generously. Now, why is that? Because when you see God as generous, you know that you don't have to earn what God's already given to you. If you see God as joyful, you'll live your life with joy. Why is that? Because your understanding of how God sees you is going to shape everything else about you. That's exactly what Jesus is telling us here in Matthew 25 as he teaches us really what it means to leave a legacy here. He's not just giving us a lesson on productivity. He's revealing who God is really like because he's teaching us you become who you believe God really is. That's the essence of this parable here. That's the difference. You've got two servants who saw the master as generous and joyful, and their faith in him produced fruit. But you got one servant who saw the master as harsh and demanding, and his fear of him led to loss and regret. Same master, same opportunity, totally different results. And it's all because of how they saw the master. And that's what Jesus is trying to tell us in this story so we don't miss that. He wants us to see God for who he truly is. So look with me, Matthew 25, and we're gonna pick it up in verse 14. This is verse 14. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one, he gave 5 talents. To another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Stop right there. Whose money? Master's money. He went and hid his master's money. Now, Gary talked about this last week, but I want to double down on it because this is the foundation of the parable. So listen, here's the first thing that Jesus is teaching us. Everything that you have has been entrusted to you by a generous God. The air that you breathe, the clothes on your back, the opportunities that you have, the talents that you've been given, every single bit of it is from God. Now, we live in a world that says, well, that's really your stuff. But Jesus is saying here, no, actually, it's not your stuff. You've been entrusted by God with his stuff. And the reason that I know that, the reason that I can confidently say that is this. I've done the research. I checked the stats this week. Even with all of the crazy advances in modern medicine, all the technology, all the science, the research still points to this sobering fact. It's just crazy. The death rate is still at 100%. Which means that every single one of us in here, unless Jesus comes back, we're gonna die. What's gonna happen is they're gonna dig a hole. They're gonna put us in it, they're gonna come back to the church. They're gonna eat potato salad and they're gonna talk about how good of a person that you were. And then our kids are gonna go through our stuff. And they are gonna make fun of us for all the stuff that we just had to have. Look at mom's skinny jeans. Can you believe that? Why does dad have 47 Yeti cups? They're gonna take what they want and the rest of it's gonna go to a garage sale. Unless you're making bank and it's gonna be called an estate sale. But it's the exact same thing. Now, why do I stress that point? Because when you realize that you own nothing, when you finally realize that God has entrusted you with everything and that he is a generous God, it changes how you see your stuff. Because at that point, when you see God as generous, what you've been given stops being something to guard, and it stops being it continues to be something that you can give away. What's gonna happen is that you stop gripping your stuff and you start giving your stuff. Because at that point, you see God as a generous God. And what Jesus is showing us here is that, yeah, the master owns it all, but he's also a master that is generous with everything that he owns. He's not a stingy landlord who's keeping score. He's a generous father who loves to give it away. Now look at verse 19. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing the 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little, and I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. So, number 1, Jesus is teaching us that God is generous. But the second thing is that Jesus is teaching us that God is joyful. See, you're not a worker who's trying to earn God's approval. That's not who you are. You're a son, you're a daughter who's been invited into his joy. And listen, when you see God as joyful, you stop working for his approval and you start living from his delight. Let me show you something that's subtle, but it's incredibly important in the text. Notice that when the master returns, it's the 5 talent servant and the 2 talent servant who come forward first. Now, of course they come forward first. They're pumped that the master's back. Why are they so excited the master's back? Because they got good news for the master. This ever happened to you? Your boss goes away for 2 weeks, and when your boss is away, you land the biggest deal in your company's history. When the boss comes back, who's in his office first thing on Monday? You are. Hey, boss, good morning. Coffee, newspaper. How was your trip? Ask me about my week. You want to be held accountable because you've got good news for the boss. These guys want to be held accountable because they got good news for the master. That's what these first 2 servants do. They can't wait to see the master. But I also want to point this out. Notice where they start. The first 2 servants don't start with what they did. They start with what the master did for them. Master, it was by your grace that you gave me these talents. I didn't do anything to earn them. I didn't do anything to deserve them. You entrusted them to me. And they both say in the text, here, I have made 5 talents more. Here, I have made 2 talents more. Now that word here, it's not like, look at here. It's not like that. It's more like, here you go, master. Everything I have is from you. Everything I did is for you. And what does the master say? Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. Now, do you see it? What started with seeing the heart of the master led to sharing in the joy of the master. Because when you see that everything belongs to God, that God is generous, that God is joyful, something happens to you. You start to reflect what you see. You become who you believe God is. And that's not just a truth for a sermon, that's the way to live your whole life. A couple Thursdays ago at men's breakfast happens on the first Thursday of every month. Last men's breakfast we had Gus Antos come. Gus Entos is the CEO of Milestone Electric and Plumbing. We'll fix it in a flash. It's that Milestone. You know Milestone. Milestone, we'll fix it in a flash. Well, Gus said something at that men's breakfast that really stuck with me, and it describes this perfectly. I can't get it out of my head. He said, when I think about my business, when I think about my life, I think of it like my house. If my house floods, that's not my kid's problem. That's my problem. That's dad's problem. If the car breaks down, that's dad's problem. If the refrigerator goes out, that's dad's problem. So what do I ask my kids to do? Make your bed, mow the lawn, take out the trash. Kids aren't responsible for the whole house. Kids are responsible to be faithful with what they have been given, to be faithful in small things. And that's the picture that Jesus is painting here. When you see that God owns it all, you realize this is all dad's house. It's all dad's house. He's the one who's responsible to keep everything going. He's responsible to fix what's broken. So what's your job? Just be faithful with what he's given to you. You don't have to run the house. You're just called to live like you're loved in the house. Because that's who your Father is. Again, he's not a distant landlord keeping score. He's a generous dad who delights to take care of his kids. And when you see that, it changes everything. You become who you believe God is. Now, here's what's really important though. Not everybody sees God like that. If this parable has a soundtrack, this is the point where the record starts to scratch and things go differently. Look at verse 14. Well, before we go to 14, let me build this out for a second, because I think that we need to go deeper here. I want to take this down and go deeper, because I think we need to see how it is that transformation actually begins. Think of this all like a chain reaction. Think of it like a chain reaction. If I see God as being generous, if I see God as being joyful, what's gonna happen is that's gonna create a tendency in me that I'm gonna start to live with open hands instead of closed fists. That tendency in me is gonna lead to some actions. Maybe I start giving the tithe. Maybe I start rocking babies in the nursery. I'll start serving. Those actions are gonna produce consequences. Peace is gonna replace anxiety. Gratitude is gonna replace envy. And what those consequences are gonna do is those consequences are going to form a new reality, and I start to look more and more like the heart of my generous and joyful Father. You see how it works? Your perception of God leads to tendencies, which creates actions, which forms consequences, which leads to your reality. That's spiritual formation 101. If you believe God is generous, you'll be generous. If you believe God's joyful, you'll be joyful. It always starts with how you see him, because how you see God will determine who you become. Now again, we gotta set that up, because I want you to see that that's not how everybody sees this. Again, look at verse 24. This is where things shift. This is where things change. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward saying, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours." But his master answered him, "You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed." Do you see this here? Same master, same opportunities, totally different outcomes. First two saw a generous and joyful father, and they lived with generosity and joy. This one saw a harsh boss, and he lived with fear. And what started off as a wrong view of the master set off the exact same chain reaction that we just talked about, only it was completely opposite. This servant saw the master as harsh. He saw the master as difficult, and that belief shaped a tendency toward fear and self-protection. That tendency led to an action. He buried what he had. That action produced a consequence. Nothing grew. And that consequence became his reality. Isolation, loss, regret. Why? Because the wrong belief built the wrong life. Because how you see God, what you believe about God, that's what you become. The one talent guy clearly did not know the master. That was the difference. And it was evidenced by his fear-filled life. So we're gonna respond in a moment. We're gonna sing. But before we do, let me ask you the most important question that I could possibly ask you. Do you know the master? Do you know the master? You know, I think for some of us, there's something in our life that we know is a talent, a resource, a dream, an opportunity, a calling. And somewhere along the way, fear convinced you to bury it. It's not that you rejected God, but you were just convinced that fear was the bigger thing. And so fear out of failing, fear from not being enough, fear that God wouldn't come through, you went and buried it. And instead of saying, here you go, God, you went and buried that thing. And for some of you in here today, the Spirit of God may very well be stirring in your heart and telling you it is not too late. You go and get that shovel and you go dig it up and you go bring it here and you say, here you go, God, for your glory. And for some of you today, that might mean to start tithing. Not because you're guilty about it, but because you see the master is generous for the first time. For some of you, that may very well mean selling everything that you have and going to live as a missionary in the Congo. For some of you, it may mean getting back in your minivan and going to live a life on mission in the PTA. Far more dangerous than the Congo. But I'm telling you right now, that will not happen unless you see the master rightly. Do you know the master? Do you believe that he owns it all? Do you believe that he's generous? Do you believe that he's joyful? And I'm just saying, maybe that's what we need right now. Maybe we need some wonder at who this God is, not just for what he can do for us, but because of who he is. And my daughter, she's been teaching me about this. She's 4, she's growing up so fast, and she's so smart. She's asking all these great questions. The other day we were outside, and she asked me, Daddy, who made the sky? I said, well, God did, baby girl. And she goes, okay. Well, Daddy, why is the sky blue? I said, well, baby, there's different lengths of light and their waves, and because there's different wavelengths, it produces different refractions of light, and so we see a different spectrum of color. She kind of cuts her eyes at me and she says, Daddy. And I said, because God made it blue. She said, okay. And then she asked this question. Such a good question. It's a beautiful question. She goes, Daddy, did God make blue? And I froze. And in that moment, I said, yeah, baby girl, God did make blue. And it hit me. That's incredible. We live in a world where there is a God who didn't just make an atmosphere for us to breathe. He didn't just make food for us to eat. He came up with blue. He created color. He didn't have to do that, but he did. Why? Because he's generous, because he's joyful, because he delights that we live in a world with blue and color. He's the kind of father who gave us blueberries to eat and blue bonnets to look at and Blue's Clues to watch and blue skies to run under. How could you not love a God like that? But I'm telling you, most Christians do not see God like that. And that's the tragedy. Most Christians, it's more like we see God as this cop in the sky instead of a father with open arms. And when the message is, God doesn't like this, God doesn't like that, God wouldn't be pleased with this, don't do this because God wouldn't like that, of course you're not gonna run toward him. You're gonna be horrified of him. But instead, when you see God rightly, when you see him for who he is, that he's not harsh, he's kind. He's not distant, he's delighting. That changes everything about you. But here's what takes the cake. This is what changes everything about it. This is what's actually going to motivate you to pursue this God forever and ever and ever. Because after Jesus told this parable, just a few days later, the master himself would be the one who would be buried in the ground. The one who gave it all to his servants gave himself. He entrusted talents to his servants, and then he entrusted himself to the nails. Why? So that we could enter into the joy of our master. We serve a God, we love a God, we worship a God who didn't just give us his stuff, he gave us himself. And when you see a God like that, your question isn't, how much can I hoard? What's the minimum amount that I can give? That's not what you say. You see, how could I not give everything to the one who gave everything for me? That changes you. Which is why this moment is so important. We're gonna stand and we're gonna sing a song. It's called Worthy of Your Name. Here's what worship does. Worship retrains our hearts to see who God rightly is. 1,000 things compete for our attention. When we sing a song of who God is, it retrains our hearts. And so what I want you to do in this next moment, as we stand and as we sing, I want you to sing this not just from your brain, but from your heart. And if you want to talk about legacy, I mean real legacy, the greatest legacy that you could possibly give is not your accomplishments, it's not your money, it's not your achievements. The greatest legacy that you could possibly give to your kids, your grandkids, your friends is how you see God. That's legacy. Your kids may very well forget what you taught them, but I guarantee you they are not going to forget the God you showed them. And so this morning, as we stand and as we sing, we are going to sing this song, and I want you to pay careful attention to the bridge that we sing, because it announces he's our author, our redeemer, our ransom, our savior. It announces who God is. This is who our God is. Let's stand and let's sing together.